cities. He's also repeated that his government's been surprised by how fast US forces are withdrawing. He's blaming much of the current situation on the decision to remove the troops. Ghani says his government has planned to bring things under control within 6 months, but he hasn't gone into detail. Well, the Taliban has taken more territory in recent weeks than it did at any time since it fell from power 20 years ago. In May, it controlled about 20% of Afghanistan. But as US and other foreign troops have been withdrawing, Taliban fighters are ramping up their attacks. In the last 2 months, half the country has fallen under Taliban rule. It's a critical test for the Afghan government as the fighters advance and surround the capital, Kabul. In the past 24 hours, the armed group has moved in from the outskirts to the hearts of the cities of Lashkargah and Kandahar. Our diplomatic editor, James Bays, reports from the capital, Kabul.
As fighting has intensified and moved into 3 of Afghanistan's main cities, the President, Ashraf Ghani, has again been addressing his people. He spoke to members of parliament, the 3rd speech Ghani's made in a week. Each time he's talked about the grave security situation, but there's been no fresh action announced, no details of his plan to reverse the Taliban advance.
We are aware of current problems and dangers. God willing, the security and defense forces will be getting stronger day by day in the coming 6 months, and we will reach an optimal situation again.
So a 6-month timeline to turn things around, but with absolutely no detail. Things are moving very fast and they're not going the government's way, and some diplomats are getting impatient with Ghani's approach. They believe he needs to rally his people around a new detailed military plan now. As the Taliban makes advances, their hand is strengthened in any future negotiations. It's expected talks in Doha will resume in the next 2 weeks. The Taliban's former finance minister, now living in Kabul, says it's time for the president to accept the group's demands to release a further 7,000 troops in exchange for a ceasefire.
I must say this to stop all fighting and to bring and implement the ceasefire, both sides of the conflict. The government and the Taliban should take steps to build trust.
It's clear the Afghan government needs not just a plan to turn things around on the battlefield, but also to change the national mood. There's a perception, even among some government supporters, that the Taliban is now winning. James Bays, Al Jazeera, Kabul.
Well, the US and Britain are among countries calling for an immediate ceasefire across Afghanistan, and their embassies are highlighting allegations from Afghanistan's Independent Human Rights Commission that the Taliban massacred civilians in the town of Spin Boldak on the border with Pakistan. Taliban fighters took control there on July the 14th. Posting on Twitter, the embassy said if the accusations are proved, they may amount to war crimes. Well, in the meantime, the United States says it's going to take in thousands more Afghan refugees who've been working with the US because of the increased threat from the Taliban. The expanded refugee program will include Afghans linked to US-funded projects, as well as non-governmental and media organizations. As the Taliban gains more ground, the refugees say they're getting more worried about their safety. More than 200 Afghan interpreters arrived in the US on Friday. Rosalind Jordan's following developments from the US State Department. Ros, this sounds in principle like a good offer from the US. Is it as good as it sounds?
Well, it all comes down to whether the people who are theoretically eligible under this expanded refugee designation can actually get out of the country. That is the first step for any person who wants to claim refugee status in another country. They have to leave their home country. And this is a very difficult prospect because many of the people who were working with US-based media organizations or NGOs are in parts of the country now controlled by the Taliban. The US military is, for all intents and purposes, basically out of the country. It has not been involved in the relocation so far of Afghan interpreters and their families. And so because they weren't involved in that process, it's basically the same situation with those who worked with NGOs or media organizations. These people are essentially on their own. They have to find their way out of the country in order to start the process of trying to come to the United States.
And the US Embassy and the UK Embassy demanding a ceasefire from the Taliban. Is there any indication that the Taliban might be willing to listen?
It does seem as if it is. They're making considerable progress in reclaiming territory in many parts of the country, and they're also reestablishing their political control in those areas which they have regained from Afghan national security forces. So unless there is some sort of breakthrough in diplomatic talks underway in Doha, it's unlikely that the Taliban is going to stop what it's doing. There wasn't even a ceasefire over the recent Eid holiday.
Rosalind Jordan talking to us from the US State Department. Ross, thanks very much indeed. As well as the violence, Afghans are also having to deal with floods and landslides. At least 100 people have been killed. Rescue workers in Nuristan province are digging through debris for survivors. The district's under Taliban control, which the government says makes it difficult for it to provide assistance, food and shelter.
I was sleeping in my house. In 10 minutes, the floods came and destroyed everything. 10 members of my family were killed. We've just found a child and a woman. The others are still missing.